December 17, 1944, Hansfeld, Belgium. The darkness of dawn still covered the forest when the Tiger's engine coughed, choked, and died. Colonel Joachim Peiper of the Waffen-SS slammed his fist against the hatch hard. Around it, the largest armored column of the Ardennes offensive, 67 tanks, 149 half-tracks, and 5,000 elite soldiers, was completely at a standstill. Without a single shot, the advance had been halted. The fuel had run out. Germany believed it could repeat 1940, attack fast, break the Allied lines, take Antwerp, and split the enemy armies. But that belief was put to the test right then and there when Peiper spotted a newly abandoned American supply depot. Bonfires still lit, cups of coffee on the floor, and in the center, as if the gods of war had left a gift, 50,000 gallons of aviation gasoline, high octane, liquid gold. What was supposed to be the salvation of his offensive became in minutes a devastating revelation. If the Americans could abandon such a large amount of fuel, Germany was not facing an army. It was facing a logistical ocean. This is the story of when a German colonel found what he wanted and discovered that the war was already lost. But before we dive into the data, there's one statistic that defines this story with brutal precision. By December 1944, the United States was delivering 2 million gallons of fuel a day to the front lines in Europe, while Germany launched its latest offensive with a total reserve of 5 million gallons for the entire front. The operation in the Ardennes consumed in total 2.8 million. The Americans, on the other hand, purposely destroyed more than 8 million gallons just so that the enemy would not touch them. Colonel Peiper captured 50,000, a drop in an ocean he could never cross. This is a story of contrasts as absurd as they are real. If you value the preservation of memory, analysis without myths, and the technical reconstruction of the backstage of the war, support this work. Leave your like, subscribe, and share. This helps us to continue revealing the truths that were buried among the numbers and the rubble. Fog still covered the frozen fields as Peiper's first men advanced to the perimeter of the American depot at Hansfeld. No shots, no ambush, only the sound of the wind and the crackling of still-burning bonfires. The Americans had rushed back, leaving behind rations, helmets, coats, and coffee cups still steaming. But what drew attention and provoked murmurs of incredulity among German officers was fuel. Thousands of gallons arranged in pyramids of 5 gallons per can, stacked with precision. Some still marked with fresh paint. Avgas, 100 octane. It was aviation gasoline, high performance, the kind of fuel the Luftwaffe only dreamed of seeing. To the Waffen-SS men, this seemed like a tactical miracle. To Colonel Joachim Peiper, it seemed something deeper. As his subordinates cheered, running among the piles and opening drums as if they were treasure chests, he watched in silence. He walked slowly among the gallons, doing calculations. The captured reserve was real, 50,000 gallons, enough to keep his armored column in operation for a few tens of miles. It was more than any panzer division had received in months. But then came the inevitable question. If Americans could abandon all this, how much more would they have? The answer began to emerge in the ignored details. Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffmann, who was fluent in English, walked into the depot's small administrative office. Among abandoned papers and folders, he found shipping manifests. One of them indicated the origin of the fuel, refined in Texas, shipped in New York, across the Atlantic to Liverpool, transported to Normandy, and finally delivered by road to Hansfeld, a supply chain that crossed oceans, continents, and war zones, accurately, on time, and safely. A supply capable of crossing more than 6,000 miles in less than 6 weeks. Peiper examined the papers. He read it twice. Then he kneaded them tightly. He didn't say anything. But Hoffmann, who witnessed the scene years later, said, "That's where I understood. Fuel was not just fuel. It was a mirror. Germany was fighting a war of tanks without fuel, of planes without kerosene, of armies trapped by horses and cannibalized trucks. On the other side, the Americans distributed aviation gasoline as if it were mineral water. And there was more. The Stars and Stripes newspapers abandoned at the camp carried a recent headline, "The inauguration of a new pipeline, linking Cherbourg to Verdun, with the capacity to pump 300,000 gallons a day. A single pipeline, hidden under roads, ditches, and minefields, delivered 6 times what Peiper had just captured daily." The war was being decided by pipes, trucks, and statistics. And yet in Berlin, it was believed that it would be enough to win a battle to turn the tide. In 1944, the United States was refining about 1.8 billion barrels of oil per year. Germany, even adding Romanian fields and synthetic production, barely reached 33 million. The ratio was devastating, more than 50 U.S. barrels for every Axis barrel. And even so, Hitler still spoke of strategic surprise, a production 54 times higher, a logistical difference impossible to compensate for with courage or tactics. If this surprised you, comment on shocking data below. The German High Command did not do these calculations. He preferred to believe that fate was reversible with discipline and brutality, but Piper saw with his own eyes that he was fighting an enemy that was swimming in fuel, while he himself could barely walk. The sound of jerry cans being opened, the strong smell of American gasoline, and the reverence of its soldiers made that scene almost religious. But behind the fervor was a truth that burned more than fuel. What the Germans called victory, the Americans called standard logistics. Later that afternoon, as the tanks began to refuel, Piper gathered his officers and said only one sentence: "Use wisely. That's all we'll have." He didn't know it yet, but that wouldn't be his only discovery. The real revelation would come in the next 24 hours, at Stavelo, when a wall of fire would rise on the horizon and show how far the Americans were willing to go to deny the Germans a chance. The Hansfeld depot office was small, stuffy, and covered in dust, but what was inside weighed more than any cannon. Folded maps, transport spreadsheets, and shipping orders marked with stamps of the Allied forces. Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffmann, who had worked in his father's import business before the war, immediately recognized the shape of the guides. They were North American logistical forms. He read aloud, translating to the surrounding officers: origin, Gulf Refinery, Port Arthur, Texas. Final destination, Hansfeld, Belgium. Delivery time, 41 days. Piper, who until then had been watching in silence, approached and asked for the numbers. Hoffmann walked the route head first. Texas to New York, about 2,000 miles. From there to Liverpool, another 3,000 ocean miles. Then the Normandy landing, the transport by trucks and rail convoys to Belgium, another 1,000 miles. A system capable of moving refined fuel for more than 6,000 miles in the middle of the war, with a precision that Germany could not replicate even within its own territory. The colonel looked at the map of Europe. Each of these miles was a slap in the face to the doctrine that had formed him. The Blitzkrieg relied on continuous movement, on quick attacks sustained by fuel at hand. But Germany, isolated, was trying to sustain a mechanized army with short, flimsy routes, based on bombed-out railways and makeshift depots. The United States, by contrast, had turned the globe into a network. Piper knew that the term total war had been used by Goebbels in speeches, but there in the American papers he saw the real meaning. A war where the engine of each truck and the tank of each airplane were part of the same industrial organism. And this machine did not sleep. Every barrel out of Texas was more than fuel. It was an extension of American industrial power, sustained by refineries that operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, without interruption. While the German hydrogenation plants at Luna and Bolin were destroyed by bombing, the Americans opened new refineries in Illinois, Oklahoma, and Louisiana. In just 1 month, Standard Oil produced more fuel than all of Germany in a year of war. The sergeant also found cargo manifests from the Red Ball Express, the road route that connected ports and battlefronts. Color-coded trucks, 24-hour itineraries, maintenance stations every 50 miles. The document cited 6,000 trucks operating in uninterrupted shifts, delivering more than 400,000 tons of supplies per month. Piper walked around the room with short strides. In the corner, an abandoned American radio still buzzed static noises. He watched him and remarked, almost in a whisper, "They move fuel like we move battalions." It was a finding more than a metaphor. For every German tank in operation, there were 10 American trucks carrying fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. The Wehrmacht counted liters. The United States counted millions of gallons. The colonel made a quick note in his campaign notebook: "The enemy has industry as an army." The sentence would be lost between the pages, but the meaning would remain. Outside, the roar of resurrected engines filled the air. The refilled tanks roared again, ready to move on. The offensive still seemed possible, but what Piper had seen inside that office had planted an incurable doubt. How could a nation that barely produced 2% of the world's oil beat another that controlled 67% of it? Mathematics was not forgiving. The United States had 500,000 active wells. Germany depended on few Romanian fields and an expensive and vulnerable process of synthesis from coal. When Allied bombing raids hit the Pulitz and Leuna refineries, production dropped by 90%. Even so, Hitler ordered the offensive in the Ardennes with the faith of a gambler betting the last chips. Piper, inside that office, realized the size of the illusion. Hoffman's report also mentioned a cryptic acronym, Pluto, Pipeline Under the Ocean, a system of undersea pipelines linking England to France, capable of pumping more than 1 million gallons a day across the English Channel. The colonel took a few seconds to process. Fuel pipelines running under the ocean, invisible, protected, uninterrupted. It was the complete antithesis of German dependence on vulnerable trains. While Wehrmacht trucks faced mud, snow, and air attacks, the Americans moved fuel as if moving blood through veins of steel. The psychological impact of this revelation was devastating. Up to that point, the Germans still believed that tactical efficiency could make up for the industrial disadvantage. But the papers in Hansfeld showed something different. It was no longer about winning battles, but about sustaining the impossible. Piper understood that his doctrine, built around speed and surprise, had aged in just 5 years. Blitzkrieg was born in the era of cheap fuel and limited communication. In 1944, he faced an enemy that dominated both. Germany still saw the tank as a symbol of power. Americans saw the system that kept it running. Hoffman, as he flipped through the last pages, found a curious note. Cargo protected by the 743rd Quartermaster Truck Company. Supervision, Captain J. Rose. It was the name of an American officer responsible for supply. An ordinary man who would probably never see direct combat, but who waged more war with his spreadsheets than any general with medals. Piper stared at the document for a moment. He, a tank commander, realized there that the fate of the front depended on invisible men, gears, and routes. A German officer who survived the offensive would later report, "We were taught how to fight soldiers. We found out too late that we were fighting engineers." The sun was already beginning to rise over the hills. The offensive continued, but faith diminished. Piper kept the manifestos in his pocket. The jerry cans were full, but the spirit was empty. He knew that those figures were not just numbers. They were epitaphs. And when 2 days later he saw the sky tinged by the burning 2-million-gallon fire at Stavelo, he would remember the routes, papers, and American supply lines that seemed to have no end. The next fire, he would realize, would come not from the barrels of his tanks, but from the enemy's fuel tanks burning like a wall. Months before the Ardennes offensive, far from the snowy fields of Belgium, a meeting was taking place in Berlin. It was June 1944, and the Minister of Armaments and War Production, Albert Speer, was presenting the Führer with a report that no general wanted to hear. Germany's synthetic fuel refineries, the backbone of the war effort, were collapsing. In April, monthly production had been 175,000 tons. In September, only 5,000 remained. The hydrogenation plants at Leuna, Pulitz, and Bohlen, which turned coal into gasoline, were operating at less than 10% capacity. Speer tried to explain the inevitable. Without fuel, mechanized warfare was ending. But Hitler believed in another arithmetic, that of faith and will. He ordered offensive operations to continue. He believed that the enemy was exhausted, that the Allies would not sustain their own logistical pace. The mistake was to believe that war was still fought by the bravery of man and not by the power of industry. While American engineers produced 8 billion barrels of oil a year, Germany survived on crumbs. Its total reserves were less than 2% of American capacity, and yet official discourses proclaimed self-reliance. The Luftwaffe was being grounded. Pilot training had dropped from 250 hours to less than 60. Aviation fuel was so scarce that it had become the privilege of elite squadrons. The Kriegsmarine had paralyzed part of the fleet. Submarines were equipped with snorkels and sailed on minimal diesel, saving every drop as if it were blood. On the domestic front, scarcity reached the absurd. Since 1942, civilian cars had disappeared from the streets. The Gestapo was investigating thefts of individual leaders. Farmers returned to the use of horses and manual plows. In contrast, the United States was living in the age of plenty. The East Texas oil field alone produced more oil than all of occupied Europe. And while Berlin celebrated announcements of new panzer divisions, Detroit made a tank every 7 minutes. Germany still believed that the precision of its engineering would make up for the lack of scale. It was blind faith in efficiency without raw materials. Speer, in his diary, wrote, "Germany went to war without resources and hoped to win by discipline. But discipline did not move trucks, and obedience was no substitute for fuel." Allied aviation knew this vulnerability and exploited it with scientific precision. Between May and November 1944, 90% of German refining capacity was destroyed. With each attack, fewer fighter aircraft took off. In October, the High Command estimated that fuel reserves would last 3 weeks of normal operations. Even so, Hitler ordered the Ardennes offensive. He called it the last blow of fate. The order came from a cabinet that was already disconnected from the physical reality of war. The planners tried to argue that resupply would be impossible, but the Führer saw the situation as a matter of national will. If the Americans could waste it, the Germans should believe it. The cruel irony was that American waste wasn't carelessness, it was planning. Abundance allowed us to make mistakes, to adapt, to correct. The Allied system could lose pipelines, trains, even entire refineries, and still operate with plenty of it. The Reich had no room for failure. A lost train meant collapse. In the summer of 1944, Speer even suggested that all offensives be suspended and the focus returned to defense and fuel economy. Hitler interrupted him with a phrase that would become a symbol of denial. "War is won with faith, not with oil." Piper, months later in Hansfeld, would be the direct result of this thought. He was not betrayed by the Americans. He was betrayed by a system that believed in logistical miracles. In the rear, Luftwaffe officers attempted to redistribute fuel captured from the Allies. Entire tanks were drained to support chosen divisions. However, the physics was unforgiving. The Maybach engines of the Tiger tanks, designed for 74 octane, suffered from the forced use of adulterated fuels. Yield dropped, failures increased. Meanwhile, the Americans were testing new high-octane blends, producing 100 and even 130 octane fuel. The difference was not just one of quality, it was one of philosophy. The German Empire was going back to animal traction, while the adversary was exploring the limits of combustion. In 1944, an internal Wehrmacht report admitted that daily fuel consumption exceeded production by more than 600%. The document was classified, but Speer knew. The war machine had become a bloodless body. Still, Hitler insisted on planning the offensive. "We will conquer the enemy's fuel," he said. But the enemy produced so much that he could burn it. When American engineers set fire to millions of gallons at Stavelot to prevent capture, they were not just denying a recourse. They were demonstrating supremacy. This was modern warfare, a dispute over reserves and reactors. Germany was betting on courage, America in statistics. The result was predictable. Speer would write in 1945, already imprisoned, "We fight with faith against numbers." Piper, in the field, would see these numbers take physical form: barrels, trains, jerry cans, and pipelines that seemed endless. The myth of German invincibility had clashed with a reality that not even Nazi rhetoric could circumvent. And when the colonel observed a few days later a wall of fire consuming 2 million gallons before his eyes, he would understand the exact extent of the deception. What Hitler called faith, the Americans called planning. On 14th of December 1944, 2 days before the offensive began, Joachim Piper sat in a makeshift tent in the village of Tondorf, while General Sepp Dietrich, commander of the 6th SS Panzer Army, presented the final plan for the operation. Maps spread out on tables, red arrows advancing to Antwerp, deadlines calculated with illusory precision. The briefing was short, direct, and, for those who knew the reality of the front, disconcerting. Dietrich stated, "You will have enough fuel to reach the Meuse River, if they capture the enemy's fuel." This was the central tactic of Operation Wacht am Rhein, the coded name of the Ardennes offensive, to advance only as far as the tank would allow and resupply with whatever the enemy left behind. A strategic bet built on a statistic of faith. Piper's battle group received an initial allocation of 31,000 gallons. Its tanks and armored vehicles would consume more than 40% of that in just the first 24 hours of movement. The distance to the Meuse was 65 miles, fuel for 50. The difference for the German High Command would be resolved by luck and capture. It was the kind of reasoning that turned mathematics into superstition. Nazi Germany was about to wage mechanized warfare based on the hope that the enemy would forget gasoline on the way. This decision was not born of boldness, but of desperation. Since August, Speer had warned that there were no strategic reserves. Even so, Hitler insisted on the offensive, convinced that a symbolic victory could force the Western Allies to negotiate. Logistics planners calculated that the full advance to Antwerp would require about 4.5 million gallons. The Führer allocated 5 million for the entire operation, but only half would reach the units because of transport failures and air raids. It was a war with full tanks and empty trains. Piper understood the risk. It ordered its tanks to move in single file to conserve fuel and to shut down the engines during any stop longer than 5 minutes. He knew that every liter burned outside of combat was a death sentence, but the planning had already been born bankrupt. The maps used at Hitler's headquarters still showed the Ardennes as paved roads, when in fact they were narrow trails, covered in snow and frozen mud. Trucks broke down, tanks got stuck, light vehicles skittled and consumed twice as much as expected. In a few kilometers, the forecast turned into a nightmare. The fuel evaporated. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content. The logistical contrast with the United States was humiliating. While the Germans were betting on miracles, the American army had already created a redundant supply system that covered all of France. The Pluto pipeline, which crossed the English Channel, pumped 1 million gallons a day. The Red Ball Express, with its 6,000 trucks, delivered 12,000 tons of supplies daily to the front lines. And all of this worked with factory predictability. Lieutenant Colonel Chester Hansen of the U.S. 12th Army Group recorded in his diary, "We are consuming 1.2 million gallons a day and getting 1.4. We're building up reserves as we fight." This phrase alone nullified the whole logic of the German offensive. Germany was expending fuel to try to capture fuel, while the United States was stockpiling surplus in the middle of the war. Hitler's offensive, sold as a stroke of genius, was actually a desperate attempt to reverse statistical inevitability. The fuel Piper so badly needed was on the other side of the hills, in protected and well-stocked American depots. But each mile required gallons that he didn't have. Each tactical victory increased the logistical deficit. The daily reports showed an uncomfortable truth. The tanks were advancing slower than consumption calculations allowed. The fuel, which was supposed to last 3 days, was running out in 2. The doctrine of blitzkrieg, rapid movement and concentrated force, had become unworkable. You couldn't run without fuel, nor surprise an enemy you could afford to waste. Germany was betting on capturing the enemy before capturing its own logic. Meanwhile, the United States treated transportation as a science. Fuel measured by the hour, radio-tracked trains, sensor-controlled, pressure-controlled pipelines. What the Germans called tactical improvisation, the Americans called industrial planning. When Piper received the final orders, he understood that he was marching to a fight that was already mathematically lost. Even so, he continued, faith in the command was the last reserve. At dawn on December 16th, the engines roared. The artillery opened fire. Within 2 hours, the Germans had expended more ammunition than they had used in entire campaigns at the start of the war. But the logistics did not keep up with the enthusiasm. Every kilometer traveled burned the future. The offensive started out of hope and would end up moved by silence. And when 2 days later, Piper's tanks arrived at the village of Hansfeld and discovered that American warehouse full of intact jerry cans, the irony would become unbearable. What seemed like a miracle was, in fact, the harbinger of collapse, because the real fire that would light up the Ardennes wouldn't come from the cannons. It would come from the American fuel burning in Stavelot, where 2 million gallons would be turned into a wall of flame. As the Germans inched through the forests of the Ardennes, mired in mud and doubt, the real engine of American war roared far away, invisible, constant, uninterrupted. It was a flagless army, composed not of infantry divisions, but of refineries, factories, and truck drivers. Its name was the Red Ball Express. Created in August 1944, the system operated with industrial precision. 6,000 trucks, 23,000 drivers, and a single mission: to feed the front with fuel, ammunition, and supplies, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Each vehicle followed a route marked by color and number. Green meant top priority, fuel; red, ammunition; blue, rations; The roads were exclusive. No other vehicle could travel on them. The round trip from Cherbourg to Verdun took 48 hours. The trucks ran in convoys of 100, separated by 15 meters, fueled and serviced at each stopping point. The system delivered 12,500 tons of material daily, of which 3,000 were fuel. In 4 months, the Red Ball Express transported more than 412,000 tons. The Americans had turned the military transport into an assembly line on wheels. And meanwhile, Germany was trying to keep its armies operating with destroyed railroads and pack horses. The superiority was not only in quantity, but in structure. Each GMC Jimmy truck used the same engine, the same parts, and interchangeable tires. Average consumption was 8 miles per gallon, a remarkable efficiency for vehicles loaded in rough terrain. Field workshops produced repairs in less than an hour, and each part changed fit any other model. The result was predictability. Every gallon had a destination. Every minute had value. On the other side, the Wehrmacht was dealing with a chaotic mosaic. Captured trucks of French, Soviet, and Italian origin, all requiring different parts, different oils, and specific maintenance. Logistics officers spent more time trying to combine components than moving supplies. It was a war within a war, and the Americans won it without having to shoot. The pipeline system consolidated this supremacy. The Pluto, pipeline under the ocean, connected England to France under the English Channel, pumping 1 million gallons a day. From the coast, the network branched out across Europe, reaching as far as Paris, Verdun, and Metz. Secondary lines, such as the Cherbourg-Paris and the Seine, together carried more than 1.4 million gallons daily, all monitored by automatic pressure stations and operated by engineers trained in civil refineries. By December 1944, the Allied system was moving 8.2 million gallons of fuel per day in Western Europe. For comparison, Germany's entire offensive allocation to the Battle of the Bulge was 5 million, and half of that never reached its destination. The statistics explained the battlefield. Americans accumulated reserves as they fought. The Germans lost fuel just by moving. Lieutenant Colonel James Snyder, director of logistics for the U.S. First Army, recorded that the American daily consumption was 7.5 million gallons and that the system still delivered 8.2 million. A daily net gain in full offensive. The enemy saved, the Americans wasted, and paradoxically, that waste was the ultimate sign of power. The leftover fuel was used to train, heat, and even power mobile hospitals. Ambulances traveled hundreds of miles on the same fuel that a Tiger consumed in 10. Abundance created comfort, and comfort created confidence. Behind the scenes of the war, America had mastered the concept of integrated logistics. The fusion of transportation, maintenance, production, and consumption into a single continuous stream. For every soldier at the front, there were 67 support personnel, mechanics, drivers, engineers, cooks, radio operators. It was an unprecedented proportion in military history. Germany, on the other hand, had 6. This difference not only underpinned American advancement, it redefined what it meant to be a military power. War ceased to be the domain of the soldier and became the domain of industry. By the end of 1944, the United States was producing 1 tank every 7 minutes, 1 aircraft every 5, 1 ship per day. Standardization was so absolute that factories could switch production in a matter of hours. Airplanes turned into trucks, trucks into tractors, tractors into generators. The entire economy was a cog in the wheel of war. Piper, who saw his tanks choking for lack of gas, was facing an enemy who had weaponized abundance. While American fuel crossed oceans, its own relied on horses pulling barrels down icy roads. This asymmetry was the true invisible wall that separated victory from defeat. The American soldier slept warmed by running engines. The German soldier woke up to the cold of dead engines. It was a war decided by leaders and by hours. When Piper's units finally reached Stavolo and saw in the distance columns of smoke rising from the horizon, they believed this was a battle in progress. It wasn't. These were American warehouses being set on fire by the engineers themselves. Millions of gallons burned deliberately to deny the Germans any chance of capture. This was the visual translation of American logistical superiority, the power to destroy what the enemy would die to possess. And it would be there in front of that inferno of flames that Piper would understand the extent of the impossible. American fuel could burn for days, and even then, it would not be needed at all. In the late afternoon of December 17, 1944, The Ardennes sky began to glow in hues that no sunset could explain. The spearhead of Piper's combat group was advancing along narrow roads, with tanks breathing black smoke and engines roaring in agony. Ahead, a new village, Stavelot. Reconnaissance reports indicated that there was a large American fuel depot there. It was the opportunity everyone had been waiting for, the chance to refuel and continue the advance toward the Meuse River. Piper believed that if he conquered Stavelot intact, he could still turn disaster into victory. But when his vanguard reached the outskirts of the city, he saw something that no report could predict. A column of thick smoke spiraled into the sky, black as coal and visible from miles away. The heat could be felt even before the tanks reached the main road. When the first Tiger positioned itself on the curve, the scene revealed itself in all its dimension. The American warehouse was burning. It was a wall of fire, alive, furious, gobbling down 2 million gallons of gasoline. The flames exceeded 100 feet in height, spitting flames that roared like bomber engines. Captain John Brewster of the 281st Engineer Battalion had received the order just hours earlier: deny fuel to the enemy at any cost. He and his men opened the valves, smeared gasoline among the stacks of jerry cans, and threw white phosphorus grenades. The impact was immediate. The ground shook. The entire warehouse exploded like a volcano. Within minutes, the Ardennes sky turned into a hell. Piper's tanks braked abruptly. The crew watched in silence, their faces illuminated by the red light of the flames. The sight was hypnotic and absurd. Millions of gallons of fuel deliberately burning. Every drop that evaporated was the equivalent of what Germany struggled to produce in an entire month. For the colonel, the meaning was inescapable. The enemy could destroy what he could never possess. It was logistical triumph in its cruelest form, an abundance so great that it could be burned without regret. Lieutenant Ulf Dingler, who witnessed the fire, would recall years later, the heat was so much that we could feel it inside the tanks, and the silence. I will never forget the silence. No one could speak. As Piper stepped down from his tower, the driver, Untersturmführer Werner Fuber, asked, "What now, sir?" Piper replied only, "They can afford to burn what we would die to conquer. The war is over. They just haven't told us yet." The fire burned for 3 days. Allied planes flying over the region reported plumes of smoke rising to more than 1,000 feet. The flames consumed enough fuel to move the entire division from Piper to Antwerp and bring it back. The Americans had turned their own waste into a psychological weapon. Germany, which since 1942 had been investigating thefts of individual leaders, watched helplessly as millions of gallons disappeared into thin air. In intercepted reports, the American High Command described the episode with operational matter-of-factness. Depot 14A, denied to the enemy. Total losses, 2,189,000 gallons. No drama, no regret. It was just a line in a report. But for the Germans, it was the epitaph of mechanized warfare. Piper, who had hitherto believed in audacity, saw in it the physical representation of what Speer had called the difference between faith and industry. Stavelot's fire was not a tactical accident. It was a deliberate display of force. The American fuel burned as a reminder that Germany was fighting a nation that possessed oceans of oil, refineries that never slept, and engineers who turned raw material into supremacy. On the other side of the hills, other warehouses would be set ablaze in the same way. 1.1 million gallons at Trois Ponts, 2.5 million at Spa. In total, more than 8 million gallons were destroyed in a week to prevent the Germans from refueling, the equivalent of the entire offensive reserve of the Third Reich. The enemy, who had previously been seen as decadent and weak, now demonstrated the kind of power that didn't need to be displayed in parades. Just light a match. In the American command, no one cared about the losses. New convoys were on the way. New pipelines were being activated. New refineries were already producing replacement even before the ash cooled. What for Germany was a mortal blow, for the United States was a routine. A report from the time records that on the same day that Stavelot burned, the Pluto system pumped another 1 million gallons under the English Channel. War had become a matter of flux. While one side burned to deny, the other burned to survive, and Germany was drying up. As the fire began to subside, Piper ordered his tanks to proceed, but every meter ahead was a countdown. The fuel captured at Hansfeld was almost gone, and what was left was insufficient to reach the next depot. Tanks that didn't stall were left idling, engines coughing up like moribunds. The contrast between the American wall of fire and the German engines choking was the exact portrait of the difference between two powers, one that burned too much, the other that didn't have enough to light a blowtorch. When the sun rose over the ashes of Stavelot, the horizon still shimmered in shades of orange. Piper didn't know it, but ahead, more deposits awaited him, all about to repeat the same fate. Fuel would now no longer be a resource. It would be a message. Dawn on December 18th revealed what the previous night's fire had hidden: immobile tanks, lines of abandoned trucks, and exhausted soldiers trying to squeeze the last drops of gasoline captured at Hansfeld out of the fuel pumps. What the day before had seemed like a logistical victory, 50,000 gallons found by chance, now proved insufficient. Piper, surrounded by maps and notes, began to make calculations on the sidelines of a report. Each Tiger tank consumed under ideal conditions 5 gallons per mile, the Panthers 1.5. But in the Ardennes, with deep snow, slopes, and dirt roads, consumption increased by up to 40%. His column had already covered about 20 miles and burned 40% of all available fuel. There were 30,000 gallons left, enough to advance perhaps another 20 miles, half the distance to the Meuse River. What Hitler's maps showed as a glorious route was, in practice, an impossible equation. Even if it captured more deposits, each move required more fuel than it could carry. Piper understood that the offensive was being defeated by miles, not bullets. The math of collapse was simple and unforgiving. Each Tiger carried 540 liters of fuel internally. With 67 tanks in the column, just one crossing to Stavelot would consume 36,000 liters, and the captured deposits were becoming traps. The further it went, the more fuel burned to reach them. The logic of the blitzkrieg, built on constant advancement, was unraveling under the weight of its own mechanical hunger. On the other side of the front, the Allied system operated on a reverse scale. The Red Ball Express delivered 12,500 tons of supplies daily, enough to move 5 full armies. Each American truck traveled up to 300 miles a day, and the fuel loss per operation was negligible, less than 3%. While Piper calculated gallons with the tip of his pencil, Colonel James Snyder recorded that American forces were accumulating 224,000 gallons a day in reserve. The war had become a contrast of proportions, one army trying to survive on liters, the other growing on leftovers, and at this point, the statistic that would torment him the most appeared in Speer's own diary. In 1944, the United States refined 1.8 billion barrels of crude oil. Germany, with all the fields occupied, managed only 33 million, a ratio of more than 50 to 1, an advantage that no strategy could reverse. If this number surprises you, comment "logistics wins" below. Germany was fighting an industrial war without industry, a mechanized war without fuel. Every tank abandoned, every truck stopped was a symptom of this systemic inequality. Piper realized that he wasn't just out of gas, he was out of a future. He knew that each Tiger consumed the same as 20 American trucks. Burning fuel meant burning the offensive itself. The reports he sent to the command were increasingly shorter, almost desperate. Critical fuel situation, refueling needed within 24 hours. The answer was always the same: keep moving forward. It was as if Berlin believed that the human will could replace octane. General Hasso von Manteuffel, upon being informed of the situation, privately commented, "We are trying to move steel with faith." In the American barracks, the situation was the opposite. The excess of fuel even created storage dilemmas. In some sectors, trucks were parked due to lack of space in the warehouses. Air supplies to Bastogne during the siege included more than 160,000 gallons dropped by parachute, the equivalent of 3 times Piper's total. For the Germans, this was inconceivable. For Americans, it was Tuesday. The difference between the two sides was not just one of volume, but of mentality. While the Germans measured success in kilometers conquered, the Americans measured in gallons delivered. Logistics had ceased to be support. It was the war itself. The German offensive, conceived as a stroke of audacity, had become a testament to scarcity. The tanks advanced, but every meter traveled brought defeat closer. In Army Group B's campaign diary, an entry dated December 18th summarizes the picture. Fuel consumed, 67,000 gallons. Captured, 55,000. Operating in deficit. The enemy had already won before the columns even met. Piper looked again at his maps and saw in cold numbers what the rhetoric could not mask. The blitzkrieg, once a symbol of modernity, had become a dead weight. The advance that depended on speed was now limited by mathematics. And on the other side of the horizon, where the dark trail of the Stavelot fire still rose, there were more warehouses, but no destination. Because fuel, for Americans, was not just energy. It was time. It was reach. It was dominance. And for Piper, every drop lost was another stolen day. He still believed he could reach the Meuse, but the Meuse was drifting away with every mile. And the worst was yet to come. For when German radio stations began broadcasting orders that were impossible to fulfill, the faith that moved the gears would turn to silence. While the flames of Stavelot were still burning on the horizon, real defeat was beginning to seep through the German ranks, invisible, silent, corrosive. It did not come from the stopped tanks or the blocked roads. It came from stories. Soldiers marching through villages recently abandoned by the Americans recounted visions that seemed to come out of a delirium. Bonfires lit with gasoline, mugs of coffee boiling over drums of fuel, vehicles left with their engines running only to warm up the crews. An American prisoner captured by a Waffen-SS patrol was found with chocolate bars, cigarettes, and a bottle of hot coffee. One of the German soldiers muttered, "They fight with a full belly." The comment seemed trite, but in the midst of hunger and scarcity it was a moral sentence. Abundance had become the enemy's most destructive weapon. Piper, who had once commanded coolly, began to notice the change in the gaze of his men. Each captured American station revealed a different world: full warehouses, tidy kitchens, excess fuel. In a makeshift hut, Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffmann found a Stars and Stripes newspaper, dated 2 days earlier. On the cover, a headline: "New pipeline delivers 300,000 gallons daily from Cherbourg to Verdun." The soldier was silent. This was not just a news story. It was an unintentional provocation, a reminder that while Germany fought for every drop, the enemy built underground pipelines that pumped abundance through the soil of France. Lieutenant Otto Dingler recorded in his diary, "The Americans burn fuel to deny use. We march 30 kilometers a day without fuel even to heat a soup." The psychological impact was devastating. German propaganda insisted that the enemy was decadent, weak, and lazy. But in the face of the facts, the narrative dissolved. How can you call weak an army that wasted what the Third Reich venerated as liquid gold? American power was not limited to factories. He expressed himself in banal gestures: an engine left running, a kettle boiling over gasoline, a soldier heated at the expense of leaders that it would take a German platoon days to obtain. The perception of this disparity eroded the pride of the troops. The conversations in the camp stopped revolving around victory and started to revolve around the absurd. One Feldwebel commented with bitter irony, "They have so much that they must use gasoline to wash their boots." Another replied, "And we marched with our feet frozen." It was more than discouragement. It was the collapse of a belief. Faith in German superiority, cultivated by years of propaganda, crumbled in the face of American material reality. Abundance had become a symbol of absolute power. Private Ernst Müller wrote to his wife, "They feed dogs chocolate. They wash clothes with gasoline. We don't even have soap." Every remark was a wound in the soul of the army that was believed to be invincible. The enemy's abundance came to be interpreted as a divine sign, an economic blessing that was impossible to combat. Piper, in a rare confession to a subordinate, said, "They have oceans. We have drops." This phrase, jotted down by a lieutenant and preserved after the war, condensed what military reports would never admit. The collapse began before the tanks stopped. Allied radio intercepts confirmed the moral crisis. On December 19th, General Courtney Hodges ordered, "Destroy all gasoline stores threatened with capture. The enemy is out of fuel." This order, transmitted openly, was heard by the Germans themselves. Each message captured was another stroke of irony. Americans could publicize their own sacrifices, because even by burning millions, nothing changed. On the German side, every leader lost meant days of immobility. In subsequent interrogations, several Waffen-SS prisoners would describe this feeling with the same tone: humiliation in the face of abundance. One of them, identified as Gefreiter Hans Richter, declared, "Seeing the Americans squandering what we held sacred destroyed our will to fight. There was no way to beat those who burned more than we had to live on." The difference between scarcity and abundance had become the difference between hope and resignation. The psychological battlefield was decided. In a note dated December 20th, Marshal Walter Model recorded after reading Stavelow's reports, "They burned millions. We are not fighting the same war." The belated acknowledgement of the truth echoed among the officers. The Third Reich still maintained the appearance of command, but faith in Berlin was crumbling. Speer himself, in a later letter, confessed that the moral impact of enemy abundance was incalculable. The fuel was not just fuel, it was the measure of modern civilization, and we were fighting civilization in its pure industrial form. Meanwhile, American troops unknowingly reinforced this image. In each reconquered village they left behind traces of comfort, radios ringing, cigarettes lit, cans of cans opened. The enemy that Hitler called the mechanized barbarian became, in German eyes, the symbol of an almost unattainable power. It was the supreme irony of war. The moral superiority that the Reich proclaimed dissolved in the face of the efficiency and abundance of its adversaries. The German defeat did not begin with the Allied bombs or the Normandy landings. It started there, the moment hungry soldiers saw Americans wasting fuel like air. Industrial warfare had redefined the concept of force. Courage, training, and discipline were no longer enough. The real power was in what could be wasted without fear. And as Piper watched Stavelow's fire go out, he knew that the hell he saw wasn't that of burning tanks. It was that of faith dying out. Because just ahead, on the snow-covered roads, another collapse was approaching, not that of the spirit, but that of the machine itself. The morning of December 20th, 1944, dawned frozen and silent. Paper's front was no longer a moving column of steel, but a graveyard of sleeping machines. The Tiger and Panther tanks, prides of German engineering, lay motionless on the narrow roads of the Ardennes, covered in snow and silence. They had not been destroyed in combat. They simply stopped. The fuel had run out. Mechanized warfare, which had begun as a storm of speed and precision, had turned into a line of metallic shadows. The Maybach engines, designed to roar like wild beasts, were now cold blocks of iron. Waffen-SS soldiers, trained to advance without hesitation, became makeshift mechanics, draining fuel from damaged tanks to feed others. The scene was one of methodical despair. Each liter extracted from a vehicle meant another kilometer of survival. Maintenance officers dismantled filters and carburetors, trying to find something in the bowels of the tanks that could still rotate. Petty Officer Ernst Keller recorded, "We did not fight the enemy. We fought the fuel gauge pointer." As Piper's column stagnated, the enemy picked up speed. To the south, Patton's U.S. Third Army was conducting one of the most impressive maneuvers of the war. In just 3 days, 250,000 men and 2,100 tanks pivoted 90 degrees north, an operation that required 350,000 gallons of fuel. For Germany, it was an unthinkable number. To the United States, a routine logistical operation. The contrast was devastating. While Piper calculated every drop, Patton consumed oceans. Allied intelligence reports knew of the German crisis through the ultra-intercepts. A radio message sent from headquarters 6th Panzer Army read, "Fuel for 20 kilometers. No refueling possible. Continue with the available resources." The American High Command read the message and understood that the offensive was over. The enemy was immobilized. The next orders were clear: destroy bridges, cut roads, and wait. The enemy would die standing still. However, the psychological impact of immobility was even more destructive than the tactical effect. The doctrine of the blitzkrieg, which had redefined modern warfare, depended on movement, surprise, and speed. Without fuel, it simply ceased to exist. Piper, who had once commanded mobile columns in Russia, now watched his tanks turn into obstacles. He was trying to organize a retreat, but the same problem that prevented him from advancing prevented him from retreating. The roads blocked by burned vehicles added to the lack of fuel, created a perfect trap. The offensive had turned into a siege. On the other side, the Americans moved with almost choreographic fluidity. The Allied transportation system, supported by a network of pipelines and the Red Ball Express, allowed for large-scale maneuvers without interruption. Entire divisions were moved from one front to the other, with the precision of a chessboard. General Omar Bradley described the feeling in his diary. "We moved whole armies like parts of a machine. They, without fuel, move like shadows." The term static war, which had previously belonged to the First World War, came back to haunt Germany. But now the stagnation wasn't caused by trenches. It was the result of power outages. In a cruel irony, the tanks that symbolized modernity became the new moats of the industrial age. Each Tiger stopped was a monument to the failure of German strategy. On a hill near Le Glaise, Piper climbed into the turret of his command Tiger and surveyed the scenery. Tanks out of fuel, soldiers dismantling cannons so as not to leave them to the enemy, trucks abandoned in the snow. The scene resembled a medieval retreat. Dismounted knights, no mounts. The colonel knew that the offensive was over, but he did not say it out loud. One of his lieutenants wrote, "He just watched, his face pale, his hands dirty with oil. Modern war died there, in front of him." The desperate attempts to save the vehicles revealed the logistical collapse. Officials ordered the last 8,000 gallons to be assembled at a single point, enough to move half a dozen tanks. But even that maneuver was interrupted when P-47 Thunderbolt planes, powered by 100-octane gasoline, began flying over the area. Each American sortie consumed more fuel in an hour than a Tiger would use in a day, and there were hundreds of them in the air. The scale of the difference had become grotesque. Piper watched the fighters pass by and muttered, "They burn what we don't have." In the following weeks, Allied reports would confirm what was already evident. Of the 119 tanks and assault vehicles that began the offensive, only 39 reached Le Glaise, all abandoned for lack of fuel. The American engineers who found them were impressed by the state of the machines. Engines intact, ammunition stored, cannons functional. Fuel would be enough to revive them. Major Robert Harrison, in charge of the inspection, wrote, "The tanks were perfect. Only 8,000 gallons were missing. Something we could request in 4 hours." What was impossible for the Germans, for the Americans, was a small logistical detour. The war had become a matter of scale, and Germany was fighting on the wrong scale. While Piper planned to destroy the remaining tanks to avoid capture, General Hodges prepared the final advance. The logistical superiority of the United States not only allowed it to attack, it allowed it to attack in any direction. The American army could move faster than the enemy could react, and the irony was inescapable. The country Hitler considered undisciplined had created the most efficient war machine in history. When the first sounds of explosions echoed through the valleys, marking German tanks being destroyed by the men themselves, the sound was not of combat. It was the noise of an era ending. The German mechanized warfare, which had begun with the roar of engines sweeping through Poland, now ended quietly in the cold of the Ardennes, and the echo of that silence carried an even more bitter truth. Americans had not only won the battle, they had redefined the very idea of war. Over the next few days, Allied intercepts would record a new radio message coming from Piper's barracks. No fuel, no possibility of movement, waiting for instructions. The answer never came, because at the top of the German command, no one else knew what to say. The winter of 1944 didn't just bring snow to the Ardennes, it brought the ultimate demonstration of what American logistical power meant. While Piper and his men were paralyzed at Le Glaise, trying to survive with empty tanks and trucks turned into shelters, a few miles away an American town was completely surrounded. Bastogne, a strategic point at the crossroads of Belgian roads, had been cut off by the German advance. Inside it, the 101st Airborne Division held out without land supply routes, surrounded by enemy armor and artillery. Any conventional army would have succumbed, but the American army had a new kind of supply line: the sky. At 9 a.m. on December 23rd, the roar began. A formation of 316 C-47 Skytrain aircraft, accompanied by P-47 Thunderbolt fighters, crossed the gray skies of the Ardennes. Each plane carried essential supplies: ammunition, rations, medicines, and fuel. The impossible had become routine. The pilots, flying low under anti-aircraft fire, dropped colorful containers with numbered parachutes, assigned to each company within the city. The operation lasted the entire day. By the time the last plane left the area, more than 160,000 gallons of gasoline had been delivered. In a single day of air operation, Bastogne received more fuel than Piper's combat group had during the entire offensive. This was the true face of American supremacy, not just to produce but to distribute under any conditions. Major Paul McGee, a veteran C-47 pilot, recorded, "Every gallon we threw was worth a man's life down there. But we knew there was more waiting in Cherbourg, in Paris, and Liverpool. The fuel seemed infinite, and in fact it was. The American transportation system had become so versatile that air replaced the ground. Fuel no longer needed to follow roads. He was traveling by parachute. The contrast with the enemy was cruel. While the Americans created aerial supply lines in real time, the Wehrmacht still tried to move barrels along destroyed roads, dragged by horses. The technological difference was not only in the machines, but in the mentality. General George Patton, observing Bastonia's operations, said a phrase that would define modern warfare. "No army is defeated as long as it can move, and we always move." Flexibility had become the new weapon. The American ability to convert civilian transport planes into air bridges, trucks into hospitals, pipelines into mobile arteries, was the pinnacle of a system in which logistics decided the battle before the first shot was fired. The enemy could cut routes, destroy bridges, besiege cities, but he could not contain the air. The Luftwaffe, in turn, no longer existed as an operational force. He lacked fuel even for training. By December, 80% of German fighters were on the ground. In contrast, each American resupply mission used more gasoline in a single day than the Luftwaffe had for an entire month of operations. The Ardennes offensive, designed to break the spirit of the Allies, was turning into a laboratory of American industrial superiority. Bastogne didn't just resist, he grew in strength with each day of siege. Modern warfare had changed its axis. Now it was not a question of who shot the most, but who delivered the most. American supremacy was not just numerical, it was elastic. In the face of adversity, he adapted. When the trucks could not pass, the trains came. When the roads were destroyed, the pipelines appeared. When the ground was lost, the sky took over. And all this was driven by an industrial base that operated in continuous rotation, day and night, in 3 production shifts. Germany, on the other hand, could no longer power its own machine. The refineries at Pölitz and Leuna were in ruins, the railroads bombed and fuel stocks reduced to fractions. Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments, would later write, "In 1944, Germany did not only lose the ability to fight, he lost the ability to move." The final irony was that as Piper watched his tanks die idle from lack of fuel, American planes flew over his head, dropping fuel on besieged cities. American logistics didn't just defy geography, it rewrote it. Colonel James Snyder calculated that during the siege of Bastogne, the Americans delivered by air 2,000 tons of supplies, of which 20% was fuel. A small number compared to the total American scale, but gigantic compared to Germany. It was equivalent to the monthly production of synthetic fuel of the entire Reich in its last months. The proportion bordered on the absurd. In the middle of winter, the United States moved air and earth to supply an isolated point while the enemy was unable to fuel its own offensive. The difference was beyond quantity. It was philosophical. The American system was built on redundancy, the German about hope. While one worked by excess, the other survived by improvisation. From Bastogne, the war had become unambiguous. The Allies could be surprised tactically, but never logistically. And for Piper, isolated in L'Église, the realization was painful. What he saw in the skies, those planes cruising with mechanical precision, were not just transportation machines. They were the embodiment of what Hitler never understood. Power was no longer in the cannons but in the gallons. And as the siege of Bastogne broke and the planes continued their refueling missions, a new phase of the war was consolidating, not that of individual courage, but that of the collective industrial machine. For while Germany was fighting through winter, the United States was already fighting against the clock, and it was winning both. And soon, American superiority would no longer be just a matter of movement. It would be measured in something even more definitive, the time it would take the enemy to admit that the war was indeed over. While Germany struggled to move its last tanks, the American industrial world was already producing enough to replace them before they were even destroyed. It was the war of numbers, fought not in the snow-covered fields but on the drawing boards of engineers and assembly lines in Detroit. The Tiger the Fur, pride of German engineering, weighed 57 tons, consumed 2.5 gallons of fuel per mile, and required a team of 5 highly trained men. Its 100mm frontal armor made it almost invincible in direct combat, but its efficiency ended there. For every Tiger produced, the United States made 4 M4 Sherman tanks, lighter, faster, and infinitely easier to maintain. The cost of a Tiger was equivalent to 320,000 Reichsmarks, that of a Sherman, about $33,000. But the real difference was in the logistics. A Tiger needed 15 tons of spare parts per year, a Sherman less than 3. Germany bet on artisanal precision, the United States in industrial standardization. While German workshops forged tanks as if they were works of art, American factories produced them as if they were screws. The result was not beauty, it was volume. And volume, in 1944, was power. Each Tiger captured represented a symbolic victory. Every 10 Sherman sent to the front represented a statistical victory. U.S. Colonel Creighton Abrams described this difference clearly. The Tiger is a monument, Sherman is a tool, and modern warfare always favors tools. Germany did not understand that industrial arithmetic had replaced heroic tactics. The Tiger could destroy 3 Shermans in the open, but the Americans always brought the 4th, and the 5th, and when one was destroyed, another was already on its way, supplied, overhauled, and ready. The Chrysler and Ford plants operated 24 hours a day, in 3 shifts, producing up to 2,000 tanks per month. In contrast, Germany produced 250 Tigers in the same period, each requiring hundreds of hours of manual labor. It was the difference between a workshop and an assembly line, and while the Reich prided itself on its perfect tanks, perfection became irrelevant in the face of volume. German engineering produced the extraordinary. American engineering produced enough. This was the difference that decided the fate of nations. Reports from Speer's Ministry of Armaments showed the collapse. Tiger production had peaked in July 1944 with only 84 units per month. The Americans manufactured 49,234 Shermans by the end of the war. If this number surprises you, comment "absolute power" below. The difference wasn't just industrial, it was conceptual. The Americans designed the Sherman based on the idea of maintenance in the field. Any part could be replaced with standard tools. The entire tank could be disassembled and reassembled by mechanics without specialized training. Gasoline engines, although less powerful than German diesels, could be manufactured in series at any automobile plant. Most importantly, the Sherman shared components with trucks, tractors, and transport vehicles. This meant that the American Army did not need separate supply lines. The same gallon of fuel that moved a truck moved a tank. The same part that repaired a Jeep was used in an armored transmission. American standardization turned the chaos of war into a replicable system. Germany, on the other hand, was immersed in its own complexity. Each tank had a different engine, a unique transmission, mismatched ammunition gauges, and parts that didn't fit between models. Logistics officials called it the catalog wars, and lost. The Tiger, in theory, was the ultimate predator. In practice, it was a beast that died of hunger. In the field, the Shermans attacked in groups, coordinated by high-frequency radios, another luxury that most German tanks did not have. American communication was so efficient that a platoon of tanks could take direct orders from observation planes in real time. The Germans still relied on flares, messengers, and intuition. The result was predictable. The Wehrmacht's elite tanks, without fuel and without coordination, faced swarms of Shermans that seemed to sprout from the horizon. Private Hans Müller, captured in January 1945, described the sensation: "We shot 1, 2, 3. They kept coming. When we destroyed 5, 10 appeared. It was like fighting a factory. The myth of the invincible tank died in the face of the invincible statistic, and when the fuel ran out, the difference became grotesque. The Tiger could remain motionless for days, waiting for refueling that never came. The Sherman, on the other hand, was given daily fuel, nightly overhauls, and even heated cafes in the camps. War had become a matter of maintenance, not glory, and in that arena, Germany was fighting the inevitable. Even the Luftwaffe, once a symbol of German technological advancement, could no longer protect its own columns. By December 1944, only 20% of planned air support missions had been flown, not because of a lack of planes, but because of a lack of fuel. Meanwhile, the United States was burning 7.5 million gallons a day in Europe. Each hour of flight time of a B-17 consumed 1,200 gallons, and yet, the fuel flowed uninterrupted. That was the difference between industry and ideology. The Third Reich believed that strength resided in man and the perfect machine. America proved that strength resided in the system. German perfection required fuel, parts, and time, 3 resources that the industrial war did not forgive. In 1945, the last Tiger produced in Kassel never saw combat. There was a lack of gasoline to move him to the front. The war had turned into a competition between tanks and numbers won. And as American officials recorded the captures, one of them, Major John Hicks, made an almost prophetic observation. Germany lost because it tried to manufacture monsters. We won because we made machines. Modern warfare had a new commandment. Quality without quantity is defeat in slow motion. And on the horizon, where the German column stopped, a new truth approached. It was not enough to produce tanks. It was necessary to feed an entire world of steel and gasoline. In the frozen trenches of the Ardennes, while German tanks stood still and American engines echoed incessantly on the roads, the war began to be written in another way, in letters. They were simple, short letters, many never sent, others intercepted by military censorship and filed as enemy propaganda. But in them there was something more powerful than any communique from the high command, the beginning of internal surrender. Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS soldiers, men shaped by the ideology of superiority, began to describe what they saw with bewilderment and amazement, an American abundance that seemed supernatural. Private Ernst Müller wrote to his wife, "They wash their clothes with gasoline, feed dogs with chocolate, and leave the engines running just to warm up. We marched until the soles of our boots burned." The letter was censored, but copies circulated among companies. The impact was devastating. Nazi propaganda had constructed the American enemy as materialistic, weak, undisciplined, and yet, in the Ardennes, materialism had become invulnerable. Each prisoner captured brought stories that undermined the morale of the German troops. Corporal Wilhelm Graf wrote, "Americans throw away whole rations because they prefer chocolate. Our men would die for a crumb like that." The myth of German spiritual purity, confronted with the reality of industrial abundance, quickly shattered. Faith in racial superiority had given way to silent envy for the enemy's efficiency and comfort. What began as a logistical shock became an ideological collapse. A veteran sergeant on the Eastern Front remarked, "In Russia, the enemy was freezing to death like us. Here, Americans sleep hot." Every such remark was a bullet that struck German pride. Morale did not collapse into a scream, but into murmurs. On nights without fuel, soldiers would sit around makeshift campfires and talk about what they had seen. They burned fuel to cook. We burned furniture. Comparisons multiplied, slowly eroding confidence in Berlin. The letters that escaped censorship reached families and from them to small communities, spreading discouragement like a virus. German civilians, who had been living under extreme rationing since 1942, began to realize the magnitude of the official lie. The Reich, which presented itself as the bulwark of modernity, fought a medieval war against an enemy that operated on a continental scale. In documents captured after the war, General Alfred Jodl would acknowledge, "When our men began to write about American plenty, I understood that defeat had already reached the spirit before the front." American abundance wasn't just material, it was psychological. The American soldier supplied, fed, warmed, fought with the feeling that he would lack nothing. The German soldier, on the other hand, struggled with the constant fear that he lacked everything. This difference, invisible on the maps, determined each confrontation. The American army fought with confidence. The Wehrmacht, hungry. The reports became so frequent that the Ministry of Propaganda, led by Goebbels, had to issue directives to censors. Letters describing the opulence of the enemy must be intercepted immediately. Such information eats away at the spirit of sacrifice. It was too late. Morale was broken. Private Hans Richter wrote in his personal diary, found after the war, "They drive tanks as we walk. Every gallon they waste is a month's worth of our ration. War is not just, it is infinite." And it was this perception of infinity that destroyed the German faith. Mechanized warfare required fuel, parts, and food, but most of all, it required belief. And when that belief disappeared, the machine stopped. The cards reveal the exact moment when the Germans realized that the enemy was fighting with a resource that could not be defeated, the ability not to feel lack. For Americans, the loss of a truck was statistical. For the Germans, it was tragedy. When the first defections began to occur, it was not out of fear, it was out of moral exhaustion. Men simply saw no purpose in fighting against the infinite. Lieutenant Karl von Eckhart, captured in January 1945, confessed to interrogators, "We knew we could not win. When I saw an American throwing away a plate of food, I understood that we were fighting for nothing." The spiritual collapse preceded the military one. The Reich's own censorship machine began to crumble under the volume of intercepted correspondence. In an internal report dated January 3, 1945, the propaganda ministry concluded, "The view of American abundance is destroying faith in our cause. The people begin to doubt the purpose of the war." That was the final blow, not from bombs, but from words written in pencil on campaign paper. The letters, accumulated in boxes marked confidential, revealed a country divided between imposed heroism and lived despair. A soldier of the Hitler Youth, only 17 years old, wrote in his last letter before capture, "They have everything. We have only promises." This phrase would echo as an epitaph of an empire that confused pride with power. Meanwhile, the Americans advanced, moving armies as if moving pieces on a predictable board. The war, which for Germany was a matter of survival, for the United States had become a management problem, and it was exactly this difference between urgency and control that marked the end. Because soon, German letters would stop talking about abundance. They would start talking about something deeper, doubt, and when doubt catches up with an army, no fuel in the world is able to move it again. The winter of 1945 had already buried more than bodies in the Ardennes. It had buried the Third Reich's last illusion of invincibility. The war of tanks and doctrines gave way to a war of numbers, and the propaganda that had sustained Hitler's empire began to crumble in the face of the reality that no discourse could deny. In the underground offices of Berlin, the Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, recorded in his diary a confession that would never be published. The enemy not only has more weapons, he has more of everything. Their ability to waste is itself a form of power. It was the first time the regime had acknowledged, even in silence, that American waste, once portrayed as moral weakness, had become a symbol of supremacy. While Nazi radio was still broadcasting promises of miraculous turnarounds, reports from the front said otherwise. The offensive in the Ardennes was stalled, the German deposits dried up, Piper's tanks abandoned, and on the other side, the Americans held 3.5 million gallons of fuel in reserve in the Reims region alone, enough to fuel the entire Allied offensive for a week without replacement. For a diet that measured success in liters, that number sounded like a sentence. The irony was complete. The empire that boasted of its technical superiority had been defeated by logistical spreadsheets. The German high command tried to mask the disaster with optimistic reports, but the field officers no longer believed it. The propaganda, which for years had turned scarcity into virtue and sacrifice into glory, now rang hollow. Sergeant Wilhelm Kruger wrote in his diary, "They say we are retreating by strategy, but our tanks don't retreat, they stop." Piper's silence had become emblematic. The colonel, once a symbol of Nazi audacity, no longer made speeches or sent reports. I just watched. Its officers reported a new behavior among the troops: passive disobedience. No one deserted. No one revolted. They just stopped believing. The orders came and were carried out slowly, as if the sense of duty had dissolved in the cold. In Berlin, Minister Speer sent increasingly alarming reports. 90% of synthetic fuel refineries were out of operation. Rail transport had collapsed. The remaining reserves would barely sustain a month of war. Hitler, however, insisted on offensive plans, demanding that Speer find technical solutions to the faith. But faith did not move engines. Faith was no substitute for gasoline. Faith did not cross the Atlantic carrying barrels of Texan oil to the beaches of Normandy. The difference between belief and structure became visible even to the most fanatics. Goebbels, who had devoted years to building the narrative of German moral superiority, began to record in a somber tone, "The enemy is materialistic, but materialism has won." The campaign radios, unable to hide the collapse, began to repeat the same speech in an almost ritual tone. "The Führer trusts us. Fate will be reversed." But the soldiers already knew that it would not be. In the American camps, on the other hand, the sound was different. Engines warming up, radios transmitting music, trucks unloading supplies at an incessant pace. The contrast was so stark that the captured German prisoners themselves described the enemy camps with astonishment. "They have everything in excess. Food, clothes, fuel. It's like fighting a factory." This perception, multiplied by hundreds of reports, dismantled Nazi propaganda faster than any offensive. The war was no longer a contest of courage but of replacement capacity, and the United States, with its factories operating 24 hours a day, has turned replacement into art. Each tank lost was replaced in days. Each truck burned in hours. Germany, which prided itself on technical efficiency, now faced the weight of its own rigidity. The American system, based on standardization and excess, flowed. The German system, based on precision and scarcity, broke down. Propaganda, accustomed to selling heroism, no longer found space in front of numbers, and when the numbers began to circulate among the officers, pride crumbled. American fuel production in 1944 had exceeded 1.8 billion barrels, 55 times more than the total capacity of the Reich. Each day of war cost the United States more fuel than Germany produced in a month. It was a mathematics impossible to refute, a statistic that no discourse could dispute. If these numbers impress you, comment on shocking data below. Goebbels himself would recognize the power of this arithmetic. In an excerpt from his diary of February 1945, he wrote, "Modern war is an equation, and we lost the formula." The enemy that the regime called decadent had shown what it really meant to be modern. Not the most powerful tank, but the fuel to power it. Germany had not been defeated by brute force, but by constancy, by the machine that did not stop, by the train that did not stop, by the soldier who never ran out of supplies. The collapse of propaganda was the collapse of belief. Blind faith in the doctrine of racial superiority had been transformed into administrative silence. No message of hope could survive when reality itself cried out otherwise. War, after all, was no longer a matter of flags or ideologies. It was a matter of gallons. And to that extent, Germany was empty. At the end of January, Goebbels would write his last note on the subject. The demoralizing force of American waste is greater than any bomb. It was the bitterest confession of the entire regime, and the prelude to its ruin. For soon, when the fuel ran out on the roads and even the German radios fell silent, the war would become absolute silence. And in that silence, Americans would already be preparing for the next step, one that neither the Germans nor the world were ready to comprehend. In the final days of December 1944, when the snow was already covering the roads and the noise of German engines ceased one by one, the Reich High Command began to understand what the soldiers in the trenches had known for weeks. The war had ended. It just had not yet been officially admitted. In makeshift bunkers, experienced generals, men who had crossed continents under the banner of victory, now looked at maps that no longer made sense. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army, would write years later, "We did not lose in the fields of Belgium. We lost in the factories of Detroit." He had been one of the few who had the courage to say out loud what everyone knew in silence. Operation Bulge wasn't an offensive, it was a bluff, the last bet of a bankrupt gambler trying to cheat a casino with infinite credit. Hitler's own strategic model, based on the idea of decisive blows, had already become anachronistic in the face of the reality of industrial war. The Blitzkrieg, once a symbol of German modernity, now looked like a relic. What had once been speed had become despair. What had once been audacity was now irrationality. Manteuffel described in his post-war interrogation, "The plan depended on capturing American fuel. This is not strategy, it is faith." The term would become recurrent among high-ranking prisoners. Logistical faith, the blind belief that through willpower it would be possible to replace tons of oil with patriotism. Field Marshal Walter Model, one of Hitler's most respected generals, expressed this with bitter irony at an emergency meeting. "America moves divisions as we move regiments. We're playing chess with dominoes." He knew that mechanized warfare required an industrial base that Germany no longer possessed. The Luftwaffe was almost entirely on the ground. Synthetic fuel production had plummeted by 90%, and the railway lines were under constant bombardment. Still, Hitler insisted that God was on the side of the most determined. But determination did not move 57-ton tanks. Determination did not fuel trucks through forests. Determination did not replace the 8 million gallons burned by the Americans in just the first week of the offensive. The difference between faith and fuel had become literal, and the High Command knew. Speer, in his memoirs, confessed that when he presented Hitler with the production reports, he expected to see resignation. What he found was delirium. He believed that the enemy was equally exhausted. It was a comfortable illusion, but the reality was the opposite. While our reserves dried up, Americans accumulated. Colonel General Heinz Guderian, the original architect of the Blitzkrieg, coldly described this mismatch. Hitler thought in kilometers, but the war is now measured in gallons. In secret meetings, officials began speaking in terms that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Negotiate, preserve resources, retreat. Not out of cowardice, but out of lucidity. Germany was facing an unprecedented logistical structure, a machine that could absorb daily losses equivalent to the annual output of the Reich. General Sepp Dietrich, who commanded the 6th SS Panzer Army, was even more direct in a conversation recorded after the war. "I knew I was lost when I was ordered to capture enemy fuel. No winning army starts a battle depending on the other's tank." This perception was not isolated. At all levels of command, realism seeped through the cracks of rhetoric. The Ardennes offensive, sold as a masterstroke, became a symbol of strategic blindness. While Goebbels's radio broadcast bravado about imminent victory, the generals wrote reports that would never be read in public, replete with expressions such as unfeasible, unsustainable, and without logistical resources. And yet the propaganda machine continued to operate, feeding a nation that believed it was fighting a spiritual crusade, when in fact it was fighting a losing accounting battle. Army minutes show that on December 20th, Manteuffel himself warned the command, "Unless the enemy runs out of fuel, which will not happen, the offensive must be considered over." It was a sentence disguised as a report. The system, however, did not admit truths. The Reich could not sustain the notion of rational defeat, so it preferred to believe in miracles. What the Americans called planning, the Germans called destiny, and destiny does not fill tanks. The irony of this story is that the solution was always before them. Simple math, clear logistics, practical engineering. If you are enjoying unraveling these facts and understanding how the war was decided by those who dominated the fuel, show your support. Like and subscribe so that we can continue to bring you more details of this true story. In the interrogations of 1946, General Günther Blumentritt would coldly summarize what everyone learned too late. Germany lost when it believed that courage could replace oil. This phrase would echo in military studies for decades, because it represented the collapse of a mentality. For the first time, the German generals admitted that they did not lose by moral or tactical inferiority. They lost by calculation. Each American tank that advanced symbolized a sum. Each truck that broke a multiplication. Power had become an equation, and while the generals wrote these conclusions quietly, German cities burned under bombardment, and the few trains that remained carried coal, not soldiers. Germany was stuck in its own obsolescence, and the world was preparing to see the final result of a war that would not end with gunfire, but with numbers. Because soon, a new weapon would emerge to prove that American industrial power was still just beginning. On the morning of December 23, 1944, the sky finally opened over the Ardennes. The fog cleared, revealing a metallic graveyard strewn across snow. Piper's columns, 39 tanks, 70 half-tracks, 177 support vehicles, were motionless, their engines cold, their fuel tanks empty. The distinctive sound of the Maybach Vi-12, which had once symbolized the power of German engineering, had disappeared. The silence was now absolute, interrupted only by the crackling of the ice under the boots of the soldiers who walked among the smoking carcasses. Piper, his face covered in soot and exhaustion, knew there was nothing else to do. At 3:40 a.m., he gathered his officers and gave the order that no German commander had imagined hearing at the height of the offensive: abandon the vehicles, burn what you can't take. The decision, recorded in the combat group's diary, would mark the symbolic end of the Ardennes offensive and, more profoundly, the end of German mechanized warfare. Tanks of millions of marks, built of the best steel in the Reich, were set ablaze with phosphorus shells, their turrets open, their cannons pointing uselessly into the void. It was the epitaph of the doctrine that had transformed Germany into a military power. The Blitzkrieg was dying, not by enemy artillery, but by lack of gallons. Soldiers dismantled radios, removed optical sights, burned documents. All that remained was too light to import. Some wept, others simply walked in silence, looking back as the fire devoured what was left of their pride. Those flames, illuminating the forest, were visible for miles. On the other end of the line, American observers reported the scene in their diaries. They are destroying their own tanks. Major Robert Harrison of the Third Army sent a laconic report. Enemy abandoned 39 perfectly functional tanks. Reason: total absence of fuel. The document would become one of the saddest ironies of war. machines designed for speed and attack, reduced to immovable monuments by the scarcity that Hitler had insisted on ignoring. Each tank abandoned was an interrupted story. The Tiger 205, for example, had covered 48 miles before coming to a stop, each costing nearly 3 gallons of fuel. The Panther 301 had been left with only 2 liters in the tank, enough to start the engine for 30 seconds. Allied reports identified that, adding up all the material abandoned by Pieper's group, it would take only 8,000 gallons to move the fleet again, a volume that the U.S. Army considered a minimum local reserve, something that could be requisitioned in a few hours. This difference in scale was brutal. For Germany, 8,000 gallons represented the end of an offensive. For the United States, they were just a footnote number on a supplies report. While the Germans destroyed their tanks, the Americans moved entire armies. Patton's Third Army, in simultaneous maneuver, pivoted north toward Bastogne, an operation that would require 350,000 gallons of fuel in 3 days. The contrast could not be more cruel. The American advance consumed more gasoline in a weekend than Pieper's offensive had received in its entire existence. And yet, from the American point of view, it was just an ordinary tactical operation. From the German point of view, it was the end of faith in victory. As night fell, Pieper and his men, now on foot, traversed the snow-covered fields in absolute silence. Those left behind detonated demolition charges on the tank turrets. The explosions echoed through the hills, not like battle gunfire, but like funeral bells. Each explosion represented a closed chapter, years of investment, months of training, weeks of combat, all reduced to ashes in a few hours. The Wehrmacht recorded the losses as materials rendered unusable due to lack of fuel. No document has been able to disguise the symbolic magnitude of the event. It was the physical and moral collapse of a doctrine. On the American side, observers walked through the wreckage with a mixture of awe and bewilderment. A lieutenant of the 30th Infantry Regiment wrote in his diary, "It is strange to see such powerful machines destroyed not by us, but by their own emptiness." To Allied analysts, this was the ultimate proof that modern warfare had been won by production, not bravery, and they were right. Each German tank burned in the Ardennes was a direct reflection of the American ability to produce 5 new ones to replace it. The war, which had begun with strategy and audacity, now ended with statistics and combustion. Pieper's diary, partially preserved, has a short, bitter sentence written in the margin of a charred page. "They have oceans. We have drops." This was the synthesis of the collapse. There was no more ideology, only observation, the same observation that Hitler's generals tried to deny, that Germany had confused discipline with power and faith with logistics. The offensive that was supposed to divide the Allies ended up uniting them even more. Each abandoned tank was a monument to the difference between planning and improvisation. The survivors marched 20 miles that night, leaving behind what was left of a force that had once been feared across the continent. When they were finally surrounded and captured, only 770 of the 5,000 men in the original group were still alive. The interrogation of one of them, Sergeant Ernst Kramer, summed up the tragedy with brutal simplicity. "We did not lose out of cowardice. We lost by math." This phrase was quoted in the American reports and would become a symbol of the entire campaign. Germany had been defeated by the industrial arithmetic of an enemy that never ran out of fuel, neither of war nor of belief. Pieper's abandoned tanks were photographed from all angles by the Allies. The images showed the metal body of the machines covered in snow, with the black smoke marks still fresh. One of them, the Tiger 213, remains to this day in the Museum of La Glaise, its tower locked and the fuel gauge fixed at 0. A monument to emptiness. Visitors who pass by ask why such a powerful army stopped. The answer is written in the silence of steel: because we ran out of fuel. But the real fuel that was missing was no longer just oil, it was that of belief. And while Pieper's men walked aimlessly across the Atlantic, American factories operated in 3 shifts, building not just tanks and planes, but the future, for the war had not yet shown its final face. The power that had set Europe on fire was about to reveal its most absolute form, and when the next fire fell from the sky, the industrial age reached its peak and its limit at the same time. Each gallon abandoned at Hansfeld carried more than gasoline. Inside those metal cans, stacked like silent pyramids in the Belgian cold, was condensed the fate of 2 worlds, one that lived on spare, the other of rationing. When Piper and his men opened the first lid and smelled the intense smell of high-octane American gasoline, they weren't just inhaling fuel. They were breathing the difference between 2 centuries. For Germany, that liquid was life, mobility, survival. For the United States, it was routine, a cog in a system so vast that it could squander what others held sacred. Each gallon captured symbolized an invisible hierarchy, the empire of production against the empire of discipline. American superiority was not measured only in the number of barrels, but in the naturalness with which it treated excess. While the Germans counted liters, the Americans counted millions. The war, which had begun as a clash of armies, had become a clash of civilizations, that of scarcity versus that of abundance. The real shock was not in the weapons, but in the relationship with the possible. In Germany, fuel was rationed as a spiritual good. Every drop required sacrifice, calculation, and faith. Civilians rode bicycles, farmers went back to using horses, and Luftwaffe pilots trained on gliders because there was no kerosene. On the other side, the American army burned fuel to move supplies to warm soldiers to light fires on cold nights. This difference in posture was the essence of power. What the Germans called waste was actually the logistical luxury that underpinned an invincible war machine. And most devastating was the symbolism. American fuel wasn't precious because it was rare. It was powerful because it was common. Abundance on an industrial scale had made every day impossible. Piper, upon seeing the canisters piled up in Hansfeld, understood that there was no possible military solution to what he witnessed. The war was already decided at the factory, not at the front. Those jerry cans, labeled Made in Texas, had crossed the Atlantic, passed through undersea pipelines, crossed France and arrived intact in a small European village in just 6 weeks. That was the language of the 20th century. Efficiency, scale, logistical precision. While Germany was trying to produce synthetic fuel from coal, the United States was moving oceans of real oil. American technology was not just mechanical, organizational era, a living network that united refineries, trains, ports, and soldiers in the same pulse. The moral contrast emerged from the statistics. In 1944, the United States produced 50% of all the world's oil. Germany, with all its fields and factories, produced less than 2%. A single field in East Texas refined more fuel than all of occupied Europe. American superiority was not a matter of genius, but of scale and stability. Industrial warfare had created a new form of power, the power to keep flowing. Whoever controlled the supply controlled the time, and whoever controlled the time won. So the German defeat didn't happen when their tanks stopped, but when their generals understood that there was no way to restart the engine of civilization they had challenged. The German philosophy of war was still rooted in individual heroism, in the belief that courage and tactics could make up for material lack. But the Second World War did not reward bravery. It rewarded logistics. Each liter lost was 1 unit of time less. Every delay in refueling, a collapsed front. Fuel was the invisible blood of the conflict, and Germany was anemic. In contrast, the American army operated as a living body, supported by steel arteries that crossed oceans and continents. The difference between one and the other was not in the soldiers, but in the rhythm. The Germans struggled against exhaustion. The Americans struggled with reserves. And it is at this point that Hansfeld ceases to be a military episode and becomes a civilizational metaphor. The 50,000 gallons captured were not a gift, but a revelation. Piper believed he had found what was missing to win, and found the opposite. What for him represented a miracle, for the Americans was a disposable leftover. Modern warfare revealed an uncomfortable truth. Abundance not only sustains, but redefines value. On the one hand, fuel was the last hope. For the other, it was a stock number. This symbolic difference was the real gulf between the Reich and the Allies. The reflection extends beyond the battle. When you look at industrial history, you realize that the American victory was more than strategic. It was existential. Germany depended on control. America depended on movement. The first believed in rigidity, the second in flexibility. And it was this flexibility that translated into victory, a system that could adapt automobile factories to produce tanks, civilian refineries to supply armies, and civil engineers to build pipelines. America didn't just fight with guns, it fought with infrastructure. Each gallon was the testimony of an ongoing process, a victory that was born before the battle. The most ironic thing is that, in the trenches, this difference seemed banal. American soldiers rarely thought about the fuel they burned. The Germans, on the other hand, thought all the time. The fear of running out of gas shaped every tactical decision. The obsession with supply had become a prison. Thus, the fuel, which was supposed to free the movement, had become a symbol of immobility. Germany had been overcome by its dependence on what it could not produce. And the American fuel, which flowed without limits, became the mirror of what they would never achieve. In 1976, 30 years after the war, Pieper would say in an interview, "That deposit was not a blessing. It was an epitaph. It showed that we were fighting against the infinite." This phrase summarizes the philosophical weight of the discovery. It was not just a losing battle, but the realization that industrial warfare had transcended the human. Individual heroism, so extolled by German military culture, had no place in the face of pipelines that crossed oceans and trains that moved mountains. The truth, therefore, lay not in the flames of Stavelot or the ruins of La Glaise, but in the fuel canisters of Hansfeld, each a fragment of the New Age, a power capsule packed in iron and numbers. American fuel was the chemical signature of modern victory, and when Pieper looked at those piles of cans, he understood that he wasn't fighting an army. He was fighting a system that did not need to win all the battles, because it had already won the war before it even started. And yet, the story would not end there, because a few months later, the power that powered tanks and planes would be concentrated in something far more terrible, a fuel that burned not just engines, but entire cities. Industrial warfare was about to reveal its definitive form. The failure of the offensive in the Ardennes was not just a tactical defeat, it was the epitaph of an entire era. When Pieper's last tank was abandoned on the snow-covered roads, Germany didn't just lose machines, it lost the last illusion that it still controlled the pace of the war. In a few weeks, the consequences became unavoidable. The High Command recorded the loss of more than 100,000 men, including dead, wounded, and prisoners. 800 tanks and assault guns were destroyed or abandoned, and what was left of the Luftwaffe all but disappeared from the skies. The so-called winter offensive has depleted the last reserves of fuel, ammunition, and morale. It was the ultimate logistical collapse, an entire nation immobilized by the weight of its own scarcity. The Allied reports of January 1945 confirmed what was already evident. The Third Reich had lost its operational capability. American forces, which consumed 5 million gallons of fuel a day, were now advancing without significant opposition. Every American gallon spent was a sentence that Germany could not replicate. The gap between the powers could no longer be measured in kilometers, but in barrels. In 1944, the United States refined 1.8 billion barrels of oil. Germany, adding all the fields caught and synthetic production, reached only 33 million, less than 2% of American production. This monumental difference explained everything: the collapse of the Luftwaffe, the paralysis of the panzers, the end of the Blitzkrieg. The fuel, which had once moved the lightning of war, now set the pace of the end. American factories operated as cathedrals of efficiency. Every 5 minutes, a new aircraft left the production lines. Every 7 minutes, a tank. Every hour, dozens of trucks loaded with supplies headed to ports and convoys. While the Reich tried to save every drop of gasoline, America created oceans of it. The American industrial miracle was not a figure of speech. It was a statistical reality. By 1944, U.S. refineries had produced enough fuel to power the entire planet. Texan and Californian oil flowed at a steady pace, transforming into air, naval, and land power. And this abundance allowed for what no Axis nation could even imagine: strategic freedom. While German generals asked for authorization for each gallon, American generals planned operations based on excess. The difference was not only in the quantity, but in the mentality. War had ceased to be a matter of bravery and had become a matter of engineering. The final irony was that while the Germans still believed they were fighting a war of men, the Americans were fighting a war of systems. Every train, every pipeline, every truck was part of a living, impersonal network that functioned with almost biological precision. Victory no longer depended on heroes, but on processes. The engine of history had literally become an engine, powered by fuel, standardization, and mass production. Germany, which prided itself on its craftsmanship, had been surpassed by the efficient mediocrity of mass production. The Tiger tank might be invincible, but each cost 3 times as much as a Sherman, and the time taken to produce it allowed the Americans to build 4. The mathematics of modern warfare left no room for romanticism. Power had become a ruthless equation, and the United States dominated all the variables. When Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt was interrogated after the war, he summed up the collapse in one sentence: "They had so much that they could burn what we died to protect." This perception, simple and brutal, runs through all the reports of the Wehrmacht. What the Reich interpreted as enemy carelessness, the gasoline-fueled bonfires, the trucks left with engines running, was in fact the physical manifestation of an abundance that Germany could never match. Modern warfare had been won by American indifference to waste. While Berlin preached austerity, Washington practiced excess, and it was the excess that won. The data were indisputable. In 1944, the United States produced 324,750 aircraft against Germany's 119,907. They manufactured 88,410 tanks against 46,857 Germans. They built 6,000 warships and 200,000 trucks for the European campaign alone. American industrial power outpaced that of all the Axis countries combined, in some quarters by margins of 50-1. This disproportion made the German resistance heroic but futile. Every German tactical victory was nullified by the overall arithmetic of production. The war that had begun with quick maneuvers and strategic surprises now ended with spreadsheets of steel, oil, and time. The front had ceased to be the battlefield and had become the assembly line. By the end of December 1944, Army Group B noted in its diary, "Fuel, 70% below the operational minimum. Moral, collapsing. Movement, restricted to horses." This phrase encapsulated the end. The army that had reinvented mechanized warfare now returned to the animal it had replaced. It was the full circle of irony. German modernity was dying of starvation, and on the other side of the Atlantic, the United States was beginning to produce more than ever before, not out of necessity, but out of impulse. The American industrial machine knew no rest, no limit. While Germany counted the days, America counted the tons. The impact of the failed offensive echoed beyond the Ardennes. Out of fuel, the Luftwaffe was forced to abandon pilot training. The submarine fleet was confined to ports. The panzer divisions, once the pride of the Reich, became defensive, trapped in ditches and forests, with no energy to maneuver. War had ceased to be offensive. It had become survival. And at the strategic level, this meant only one thing: the Reich was doomed to await its own extinction. The Americans, on the other hand, were already preparing the transition to the next phase, that of reconstruction. While German factories were reduced to ruins, American factories were expanding their capacity. By 1945, the United States owned 60% of global industrial capacity. The country had emerged not only as a military victor, but as the architect of the New World Order. War, at its core, had ceased to be a conflict between armies and had become a demonstration of applied economics. When historians calculate that Germany produced 33 million barrels of oil in 1944 versus 1.8 billion in the United States, they are not just presenting a number, they are revealing the gulf between eras. What for one was a statistic, for the other was destiny. The war died when the numbers became incontestable. There was no longer any ideology capable of balancing the scales. The factories had conquered the battlefields, and the men, both those who fought and those who commanded, had only watched the inevitable result. But even with the enemy defeated, America had not yet shown the full range of its power, for the same industry that fed the tanks and planes was about to give life to the weapon that would end the war and redefine the concept of destruction forever. Decades later, in the peaceful hills of La Glaise, Piper's Tiger still rests like a sleeping giant, huge, heavy, silent. Her turret is locked, the hull covered in rust, and the fuel gauge still reads 0. Around him, the world moved on. Belgian children play in the streets where Europe's most feared army has stood still, and American and German veterans return from time to time to look at that metallic monument that has survived winter and history. One of them, already elderly, touched the cold armor and asked the old enemy, "Why did you stop?" The German replied without hesitation, "Because the tanks were empty." No sentence better sums up the end of the Third Reich. It wasn't the loss of faith, it wasn't the breakdown of discipline. It was emptiness. The literal emptiness of the tanks. The moral emptiness of a doctrine that believed it could overcome reality with will. And the logistical emptiness of an empire that mistook courage for fuel. Germany succumbed not for lack of soldiers, but because it had fought an industrial war without having an industry to match. When the factory stopped, the front stopped with it. The defeat of 1945 was in fact a result of 1939, the mismatch between ideological dream and material capacity. That's the real lesson of history. Modern warfare isn't won in the field but in the supply chain. No army can be bigger than its logistics. No strategic plan can survive the arithmetic of production. Nations that understand this shape the century. Those who ignore it disappear from it. World War II enshrined a new universal law that fuel is the blood of civilization and that he who controls the flow controls the destination. It was oil, more than flags, that determined the post-war frontiers. Hitler's doctrine bet on faith, but American doctrine bet on the factory. And the factory won, not for glory, but for constancy. The German tank was a work of engineering. The American truck was the work of a system. The difference seems small, until it is understood that history is made not by those who create but by those who maintain. At the Nuremberg interrogations, one of the German general staff officers, General Alfred Jodl, was asked what, in his opinion, had really defeated Germany. He did not talk about tactics, nor about Stalin, nor about Churchill. He just said, "We were defeated by trucks." This confession ends not just a war, but an era. Modernity has exchanged the hero for logistics, the uniform for gear, the ideal for production. And perhaps that's the ultimate irony. The American fuel Piper found in Hansfeld wasn't salvation. It was the epitaph of war as the world knew it. If you have come this far and believe that history should still be told with facts, not myths, support our work. Like this video, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell to continue with us in this search for historical truth. Tell us in the comments, what is the most shocking data you discovered today? Was American production 1.8 billion barrels? Or the fact that an entire army stopped for 50,000 gallons? His opinion keeps that memory alive, because history, when it is remembered, never repeats itself in the same way. And so the Tiger de la Glace remains there, motionless, mute, but eloquent, a monument not to glory, but to proportion. The empty tank has become a symbol of the 20th century, a civilization that believed it could challenge the impossible, but was overcome by the mathematics of abundance. The American victory proved that, in industrial times, power is not measured in courage but in capacity, and every time the sun reflects on that tiger's rusty steel, it reminds the world that the war ended not when it lacked courage, but when there was too much left on the other side. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next real story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story, and discover the next historical fact that power tried to hide.